everyone. So today we have Edlynn with us. She is going to talk about her book, Autonomy Supportive Parenting. My name is Ashley. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing for Familius, and I'm going to be the moderator today. So we do have a few questions from folks who signed up for this webinar, and we will answer those at the end. We also have a few questions for Emily about her book. So we will get all of that taken care of at the end. First, I want to introduce Emily. So she's a licensed clinical psychologist who works in private practice with children's, teens, and adults. She has a BA in English from Smith's College, a PhD in clinical psychology from Loyola University, and completed postgraduate training at Stanford and Children's Hospital Orange County. Emily spent almost 10 years working in children's hospitals before pivoting to private practice, which has allowed her to start a writing career. Emily has written her blog, The Art and Science of Mom, since 2017, and a parenting advice column for parents.com since 2019. Emily's writing has also appeared in the Washington Post, Scary Mommy, Good Housekeeping, Motherly, and more. She recently joined the Psychologist Off the Clock podcast as a co-host and is the author of the new book, Autonomy Supportive Parenting, which we will be talking about today. Emily lives with her husband, 3 children, 2 rescue dogs in Oak Park, Illinois, and she can see the Chicago skyline from her attic window. Ooh, that's a lot. So Emily, I am going to let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Ashley. I really appreciate you making all this happen. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk about autonomy supportive parenting. As Ashley mentioned, I have 3 kids at home and we just went through birthday season. So they are now 14, 12, and 9, and I can't even believe it. When I started writing this book, I'm pretty sure they were 6, 9, and 11. Oh my goodness, they've grown up with the book. So I have been living and breathing the ideas of autonomy supportive parenting, and I get really excited about sharing it with other parents because I think it's a framework that is very validating and empowering and just takes some of the stress and worry and angst out of what has become very intensive parenting these days, which we'll talk about. But I want to start by sharing a recent experience where I had to work really, really hard at using some of the autonomy supportive strategies and resist what I call controlling impulses, or the impulse to get super involved and do something for my child that they can handle or need to learn to handle on their own. So if you follow my Substack, I shared this story a couple of weeks ago, but it's a good one. So my 9-year-old, it's his first year playing travel soccer, so it's more competitive than his rec league in the past, and he loves soccer. He's very passionate about it. And he had his first ever tournament, and he's on a team that's very talented. They have great chemistry. It's very well balanced. There's not like superstars. They all work together. But he had this tournament and he just wasn't getting much playing time. And after a game that they lost, that he really barely played in, it's the first time I have ever seen him in soccer get upset. Like, he showed being really disappointed and frustrated and said, I just barely played. So the intensive, overprotective, controlling part of me wanted to talk to the coach. You know, I know the coach, he's a really nice guy. We have emailed about my son and kind of his progress and everything. So it would have been appropriate for me to say, hey, just wondering like what's going on with why he's not playing. And I just kind of knew that I tell people not to do that, so I shouldn't do that. So I kind of waited it out. We had like an hour in between games. It was one of those crazy weekends. He just I left him alone as much as I wanted to keep talking about it. Another thing I have to work on. And he came back to the championship game. So this was the last game of the tournament. They made it to the championship. And he went out there and he was a force. He was on fire. And I realized he wasn't going to talk to his coach about it. He was going to show his coach why he should be out on the field. And I was so proud of him, because if I would have stepped in and he knew I stepped in, he would have wondered, did he play more because mom talked to the coach? I would have wondered, even if I didn't tell him, is it because I said something? No, he did it all on his own. He figured it out, and he could feel really proud of himself. And it was definitely one of my proudest moments as a mother. So I'm sharing this because I want to impart that I am a believer in this from my experience with it. I'm also really human, and I struggle just as any other parent does with some of these impulses to protect our kids and make sure they're okay, and stand up for them when maybe they don't need it. So let's get into what autonomy supportive parenting even is. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you have some idea because you're interested. The biggest purpose, the long-term goal of autonomy supportive parenting is that we are raising a child who knows who they are and feels in charge of their lives. So this is raising a strong sense of self and a sense of agency in the world. I really don't know a parent that would argue with those parenting goals, right? But how do we get there? So I want to share a little bit about behind the scenes of writing this book. I am an academic by training. My PhD is from a program that was very science and clinically balanced. And so I have a very skeptical eye when it comes to parenting guidance. And unfortunately, a lot of it that's out there is not based in the best science, and the science can be misrepresented. So I read dozens of articles, like really dry academic articles no parent wants to spend time reading. I read books. I immersed myself in this field of research, which started back in the early 90s. And I took out of that from my scientist brain and paired it with my mom brain and made sense of all the academic work in real life. And so that's what this book is a product of, is I took all of this information from these studies of toddlers, and a study of teenagers, and a study of school outcomes, and a study of depression and anxiety. Like, I put all of it into one big picture to understand how can parents use this in real life. And what this includes is both having an open and curious mindset, and there's a whole set of strategies that have been tested across these studies for the last few decades. So I'll talk about some of those strategies as we go along, but I call them the top 10 that every parent should know. Some of them will be very familiar. It's just a matter of like putting it all together in one package. But I do want to say something very important is, as I'm talking through some of the approaches, this is not like you have to do this every single interaction. We are not robots. We are humans. I think it's having the bigger aspiration to be as autonomy supportive as possible, and having that in mind as that is what we're going for in the big picture. But day to day, that is going to vary widely depending on our stress, what's going on with our kid, our lives. So it's okay to just kind of slide around a little bit. There are some days I'm more controlling than other days. And there are some days I give myself a big pat on the back for doing something really autonomy supportive. So I just want to really normalize and validate that it's at the big picture, and take the pressure off of yourselves to do all this stuff all of the time. Okay. It's thinking about, am I creating an autonomy supportive home environment for my kids, for my child, and my whole family? Okay. So how does it work? So this is what I find really cool from the science, is that it comes from self-determination theory, which is a known idea in psychology. And the theory is that all of us, all humans, have three fundamental needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And when those needs are met in our lives, we have overall greater life satisfaction and greater psychological and physical health. So we live better lives when we feel like those needs are met. And so autonomy supportive parenting comes from that theory and just means that we are supporting those three fundamental needs as we parent our children. So we are nurturing our children's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So I want to talk a little bit about each of those and the strategies that map onto them. So I want to start with relatedness because that is really the foundation. That is our relationship with our child. And they are learning from us how to have relationships as they grow and get into the wider world, right? So we are their first experience of close relationships. And the autonomy supportive approach is really focused on having empathy for what our child is going through, even if we may not totally understand their reaction, and also really working hard at taking their perspective, which is going to be different from ours much of the time. So what that looks like is asking a lot of open-ended questions to really understand what is going on for them. So if a child is suddenly not doing well in school, instead of coming down hard on you need to get your grades up, buckle down, buddy. It's asking questions around what is changing. Like, I want to understand what's going on for you. So it's showing curiosity. And it also takes out that sense of judgment that is going to shut them down. And so those approaches really are nurturing the relationship and communication, and using that builds, you really do get to know your child as they're growing up and changing and just who they are. And then that makes us a lot more effective in how we respond to them if we really get who this person is, because they're not us. Sometimes we think they're going to be just like us. And I know, like, it's obvious they're a totally different person, but I catch myself being like, well, I loved school. How come you don't love school? So it's kind of catching ourselves and reminding ourselves they are a different person. Okay, so next is autonomy. And so obviously very important since it's in the center of the name of the framework. But what maps onto autonomy are the strategies of offering choices. They have to be meaningful choices, okay? Explaining rationale for rules. So this is the opposite of because I said so. Involving our kids in problem solving and decision making. So this could be as small as, hey, what do you all want for dinner this week? So you're not doing all of the menu planning, to, okay, we're going to start a chore routine in this family. Here are your choices. Here are all the chores you can choose from. Now you choose, and let's come up with a system together about how we're going to get the chores done as a family. And then finally, a big one is aligning our behavior with our values. So this is very, pie in the sky, but think about, as you parent, what really can upset us is when we feel like our child maybe is not behaving by values that we hold dear. And our kids are going to do that because they're learning and growing and figuring out who they are and figuring out their values. So I talk a lot in the book about how to integrate values into discussions with our kids so that these pressure points or conflicts or tensions can turn into learning opportunities, both for us to figure out what's going on with our kid, and also for our kid to kind of figure out what's important to them, what matters to them, how can they make decisions and choices in their lives that feels aligned with who they want to be in the world and their personal values. Okay, and third, I know I'm going fast, is competence. So that's the third fundamental human need. And what maps onto that with the autonomy supportive strategies are expecting independence, which a recent poll came out of Mott's Children's Hospital showing that parents think they are giving their kids a lot more independence than they actually are. And then I know there was another recent study out of Journal of Pediatrics that links lower childhood independence these days with the rising mental health problems. It's not the only cause, of course, but it's something to take seriously. So we really need to work on expecting independence from our kids, maybe trusting their capacity sooner than we think to do certain things. So that leads into the next strategy, which is scaffolding. And scaffolding is the idea of knowing where our kids are developmentally, where their skill level is, and then nudging them to the next level through being supportive, but saying, I know you can do this. Like, you know how to get out all the stuff for your breakfast. I know you can pour everything for your cereal, so you're kind of like trusting, you're expressing trust and expecting their independence and scaffolding. And then finally, and this is kind of a tricky one that took me a while to figure out, but is using non-directive language and inviting instead of demanding. So this is part of really helping a child have a sense of agency. So if you think about what it feels like to hear, you need to clean your room now versus when is a good time today to clean your room? Okay. So yeah, they may still like, I don't want to, and what, right. But demanding them usually doesn't get the desired results anyways. So it's thinking of those little moments where you can kind of get their input and help them feel a sense of agency, even on things that they don't want to do. Okay, so that is the strategies mapped on to our needs as humans that we're trying to support in our children. And I do want to say that it's important for these needs to be met for us as well. So paying attention to our own needs, like, are we feeling like we're in charge of our lives, that we're skilled at what we're doing, that we are in good relationships, in a positive, supportive community? This is why I always say, like, go out for those date nights with a partner, go out for friends, weekends away. If you can figure out childcare, do it, because we have to take care of ourselves to be able to do all of this for our kids. Okay, so the threat to autonomy supportive parenting. So this is all the good stuff, right? This sounds good, hopefully. And well, I should say that what we know in the science is it leads to great outcomes, such as higher self-esteem, fewer psychological problems, better performance in school, more positive attitude about school, just greater life satisfaction overall, stronger internal motivation. It's a lot of really good stuff. And I can tell you, I have seen it in my own kids as I've been practicing it. And I know I might sound like a salesperson, but hopefully you can see that I'm a trained psychologist. So this is really using knowledge from child development and family systems, and all of this really makes sense and is a really healthy way to come at parenting. Okay, so the threat to autonomy supportive parenting that I spend a lot of time on in my book is the idea of controlling parenting. And in my book, I actually, in the sections that I take on specific topics like school or social media or social life, I compare, this would be an autonomy supportive response to some situation versus a controlling response. So you can really see what it looks like. But essentially, controlling can look like overprotective parenting, so parenting from a place of fear. It can look like hands-on, micromanaging, intensive parenting that has kind of become the parenting of the moment. And in fact, polls show that parents say that is now good parenting. And we used to call it helicopter parenting and say we don't want to do that, but we're kind of doing it these days. And then there's the old school, because I said so, traditional parenting, and kind of, well, my parents raised me that way and I turned out great. And so that kind of parenting is very heavy on authority. The parents are in charge. It's not really about the kids having their own opinions or input about rules and things like that. So those are some of the types of controlling parenting that are out there that can look a little different depending on the source of it. But at the end of the day, it's either controlling a child's psychology, like who they should be as a person, kind of activities they should be doing, who they are identity wise, and then it can control their behaviors, right? And of course, to an extent in parenting, we want to help shape positive behaviors, but that is different from controlling and feeling like our kids feeling like I have to act a certain way for my parents to love me and approve of me. So the problem with controlling parenting is that kids end up at higher risk for mental health problems, such as anxiety and depression. And I have a chapter in my book on anxiety and depression specifically, and how autonomy supportive parenting, I'm not saying that autonomy supportive parenting prevents anxiety and depression, because there's so much going on. That is just not responsible for me to say. There's so many reasons for what's going on with our teens' mental health right now. But what the autonomy supportive parenting strategies do is buffer some of the risks of developing anxiety and depression. So the more sense of agency someone has, the less likely they feel anxious and depressed. And that's just one example. The kids of controlling parents also show higher risk for substance abuse and oppositional behaviors. So what happens is kids will rebel in other ways if they're feeling really controlled by their parents. So it's something to really think about. And again, if you're like on a day and you're just like, put on your shoes, we need to get out the door. I mean, that's not the end of the world. Okay, whatever. I've done all the controlling stuff to some extent, but it's, again, the bigger picture of how we're approaching our kids and our roles as parents. Okay, I've been talking a lot, so I think I will take a breath and see what kind of questions I can answer.
Yeah, that was a lot of really great information. I loved hearing kind of your breakdown of the book, even though I've seen a lot of clips of it at this point. I've listened to all your podcasts. It still is a really good refresher. So I wanted to start with some of the questions that came in with registration. So one of them, both of these relate to how do we use this framework for a specific problem. So one person wanted to know what we can do to use this framework for picky eaters.
I know that is so tough. And I actually intentionally did not include eating in my book because it's such a tough issue. And so by training, I'm a health psychologist. So I work with kids with medical problems. And so I actually do work with a lot of kids who have trouble with food and eating for different reasons. So I know it's really complicated. I will say that mealtime can be prime time for power struggles, right? And we as parents, one of our most fundamental duties is to feed our children. And so when it feels like our child is doing something to not let us feed them in a very nourishing, nurturing way, I think we get anxious. We get really worried about them not being nurtured and nourished. And it's like this very primal worry about their well-being. But what happens is then we put more pressure on, and then what do kids, they're so good when they get more pressure, what do? They push back more and they dig in their heels. And that is, again, more proof of, I want my agency, they're showing, I want to have some control. So my general advice, and I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a pediatrician, my general advice is if the pediatrician thinks there's a medical concern, then do something about it and get some professional support. Otherwise, kids are notorious for going through all kinds of phases, and you just let it ride. Just let it ride. And I did the whole Ellen Satter child of mine division of responsibility, where I would have a fruit and a vegetable and a protein and bread on the plate, right? And I knew they would always want bread. And then it was up to them what they ate. And trust me, I was not perfect. I definitely had my times of getting really worried my kids weren't getting enough balance in their diets. But I will say now that they are 14, 12, and 9, they all eat a good wide range of foods. And I think sometimes we just got to wait it out and focus on how do we want meal times to feel, right? And if we're starting to have power struggles and arguments at every mealtime, that's not working for anyone. So unless there is a medical concern, I would say write it out. You could have them help you plan meals, get their input for the foods they want. That's involving them in decision making. But I wouldn't even use some of the other like rewards and consequences. No, not for eating, because you want them to start to tune into their own, like, I'm hungry and I'm full.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's great advice. One of the other questions dealing with a specific subject was screen time. So this person says, what are ways that we can increase motivation outside of screen time? This is a big problem with my 2 boys. Any tips?
Yes. Oh my gosh. I don't know a single parent who has not struggled with this, myself included. So I think the first question I would ask is, where's the evidence that it's too much screen time? Which I know sounds strange because we all have this fear of too much screen time. But I'm sharing this from my own lived experience with my daughter, which I actually opened the book with an anecdote from one of our blow-ups around her time on her phone. I had to look at, why do I have this rule besides all the experts telling me there should be 2 hours of screen time? What am I actually worried about happening? And is it happening? Right? And so I think, and I've heard other parents say it's too much screen time, and I find out their kid gets like 30 minutes a day, which most kids are getting more. So I think it's first looking at, how is it a problem? If it's a problem, how is my child functioning in their lives? Are they doing other things? Are they doing activities that don't have to do with screens, like sports or music? Do they see friends outside of being on screens? How are they doing in school? Are they doing their responsibilities around the house? So I think it's I had a discussion with my daughter around, this is all of what we expect from you. And if you keep all of this up, then you can be on your phone how you want to be on your phone, but all of this other stuff needs to be happening. So of course, there's going to be a lot of differences based on what's going on with each kid. If you're really worried that they're getting depressed, if there's like cyberbullying going on, there are times that a child needs more limits and intervention and reduction through some like firm, we're taking it away. But that's if there's really a safety concern in my mind. And otherwise, I think it's working with them, develop contracts with them around expectations of screen time and why, and remembering to use the rationale, of why to not spend too much time, whatever that is, gaming or on TikTok, why, and talking that through. So with my kids, I had them like look up articles about TikTok and the risks. And I regularly talk to them about what they're coming across on TikTok. And I'll even joke, I'm like, so what are some beauty tips? Like what's going on with those? I have not dipped my toes in TikTok yet. I'm kind of scared. So I don't know. I think it's keeping that ongoing communication about it, keeping your eyes open for signs of actual problems, and then collaborating with your kids on like what's a reasonable system of expectations.
Yeah, that's definitely great advice. So I don't have kids myself, but we do regularly have my husband's teenage sister in the house.
Okay.
And yeah, asking about TikTok trends is a great way to figure out what they're watching. They love to talk about the trends. Okay, one of the other questions that we have is, understanding that implementing new parenting approaches are challenging. What suggestions do you have for a parent who's trying to transition from a different parenting style how do we do this without a hard, hard shift to something completely new?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I love this question because it shows openness to change, and we don't have to keep doing something just because that's how we've been doing it or that's how we were raised. Like we can be open to new ways, and it's figuring out the how. So my first tip is to really tune into the why. Like, why do you want to do it differently? And what are your values? So when I talked about values earlier, what are your parenting values that maybe are aligning with this approach that you want to strengthen in your parenting? So for me, I wanted less conflict, and I wanted to feel closer to my kids, and I wanted to feel less stressed about. I felt like I was micromanaging a lot. I was trying to stay on top of the screen time and just staying on top of everything they were eating. And I mean, I was falling into the traps that a lot of parents do, that we feel like we have to curate every single part of their worlds. It's so much and it's so stressful, and it's also hard on them. So I think it's tuning into the why, and then look for the small steps. You don't have to go big, right? Like you can so for example, the expecting independence, right? Like maybe thinking our kids can do things sooner than we realize. My husband, who is quite the perfectionist, he was painting our outside stairs, and my son, who was 7 at the time, was like, "Oh, I want to help." And I could tell, and I had been working on the book, and I could tell my husband was like, "Oh my God," he looked at me with alarm. And I said, "This is when we say yes, because we're teaching him to be a helper. Like when he wants to help, we take it." Right now, you can be like, he found a little corner that if there was some blobs, it didn't matter, right? Like we can manage some of it, but I think that it's finding those small, like testing us a little bit. Like if we're really anxious about our kids being off in the neighborhood, for example, start with a 10-minute bike ride, right? Like, or go around the block and come back. Like just do small little dips first, and then you can get more comfortable, your kids get more comfortable, and you kind of get the hang of it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Small steps in anything is usually a great way to start. So one of the other questions we have is there an age range that this framework works best with, or can we start at any time?
I mean, I would say based on the science, there's not a consensus of this is when you should do it. There are studies starting as young as like 1 and 2. So we know that these strategies have benefits for toddlers, school age kids, and adolescents. And that's why in my book, I divide the chapters into those 3 developmental periods. So if anything, you don't have to read this whole book. You just flip to where you're parenting right now. And I would say, I mean, the earlier you start, I think the easier, because the kids are used to that kind of parenting, and they're more, honestly, like my kids have been doing chores in our chore routine now for like 3 years, and it's become so much easier, right? But if you start a chore routine when they're 14, there's going to be more resistance and pushback, because it's like, well, no, I just want to lounge around the house. I don't want to actually help clean it, right? They've gotten used to it for a long time. But it's never too late at all. And I think even if you're starting in adolescence, you have the benefit of more developed brains and thinking to really have a talk with them about why, like why we're going to shift into this different way of doing things. And it really is because it's healthier for them, right? And even if they argue or whatever is going to happen, the more grounded you are in your why of doing it and you just persist, they will adapt, because this is also, the parts of it, like giving choices and collaboration, feel really good to them. They actually, I mean, they may not like doing chores, but the other stuff, feels really good. And I've heard stories, it's been wonderful to hear stories from readers and some of my friends who have tried some of this stuff for the first time. And in fact, one of my friends shared that her 12-year-old, who I know, he picked up my book and he started flipping through it. And I'm like, oh no, what's he gonna think of my book? And he's like, hey mom, you did this to me. You did this with me the other day. And then he shared a story. And where instead of her making him do something, she asked for his ideas about it. And he recognized that it was a shift. So I've just been getting these stories, which is really lovely and validating for why I want to keep talking about it.
Yeah, it's always great to hear like how different people use your book, use your information. That's really exciting. So one of the other questions that we received was about how to apply this parenting style across different cultures. Like, are there universal principles that work regardless? Are there things that we should consider?
Yeah, that's great. I have a whole chapter on it. So first of all, I will say that self-determination theory, so the theory that we all have three fundamental human needs, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, that has been studied around the world in all different cultures, and it stands up. So, and it kind of makes common sense, but there's really been, in the literature that I looked at for this book, comparing, like Russian teenagers with American teenagers and, kids growing up in different cultures that are more about obedience and conformity. Are there differences? Like, is this not as positive for them? And it turns out that it is. The more kids feel autonomy, the happier and healthier they are, regardless of the culture they're in. I will say more needs to be done. Okay. Like a lot more needs to be done in terms of cultural differences. And there are some nuances that have come up so far. So for example, in some Asian cultures, the interdependence is really important. And so this idea of relying on each other is part of it. They call it interdependent autonomy. So it's this idea that you still have a sense of agency, but you're in community, and that's part of autonomy. Where in the West, I mean, something I've really struggled with is autonomy is often like interchangeable with independence, but autonomy is actually a much more complicated construct than independence. Independence can be part of it, but it really is a sense of agency, like a sense of I have agency over my environment. And that involves being an independent person, but not necessarily not relying on other people and relationships. So that's an example of where there can be little tweaks.
Yeah, and you kind of talked about that when you were talking about the steps, like inviting or giving them the option to help. That's still within community, but their decision to help or how they want to help.
Yep.
Great. So one of the other questions we have is about with some common misconceptions. So you've talked about this a little bit, like independence is not necessarily autonomy, but are there other misconceptions that people should be aware of while they're reading through the book?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I gave a talk at a school recently, and I actually just got some feedback online recently that was interpreting this approach as no structure and no limits. And I'm like, that's not what this is at all. Like, I am all about, and this approach is all about appropriate limits, healthy limits. Children's brains are still developing and they need those guardrails, right, that we provide them as parents. The point is that within those limits and that structure, they have freedom to explore and grow and change. And so we need to be constantly looking at, are these limits that we've put down still appropriate for where our child is? Because what's good for a 6-year-old is not for a 16-year-old. So, and it's easy to see that difference from 6 to 16. It's not as easy to see from 6 to 7, 7 to 8, right? And so I think it's understanding that autonomy is not a free-for-all. It's not, well, I get to do what I want, I'm autonomous. No. In fact, the literature on autonomy includes in the definition a sense of responsibility towards others, and understanding that how we act and the choices we make affect other people. And so that's also where the relatedness piece comes in, that we're in relationship with each other. So that is a big misunderstanding that I have been trying to dispel, that this is not an anything goes free for all by any means.
Yeah, that's great. I do think that some people, like you said, think autonomous, think independent, just kind of think let them do what they want. And it's great that you're able to explain why it's different. Um, so one of the last questions that we have is about parental burnout. So during COVID, we heard a lot about parental burnout and how the way people are parenting now is causing it more. Being home during COVID was causing it more. Just wanted to give you an opportunity of ways that this parenting style can help combat parental burnout or alleviate some of that stress.
Absolutely. So, and just for context, I signed this book contract. So I started working on this book in early 2021. So it wasn't the thick of the pandemic, but we did not feel out of the pandemic. And I had worked on the book proposal and all of that during the pandemic. So there are two layers to this for when I talk about parental burnout and autonomy supported parenting. One is very surface. If we're encouraging our children to do more for themselves, we do less. So there's that very basic, like, my kids pack their luggage for their trips now. Do you know how happy I am to not have 3 more bags to pack, right? My 2 oldest ones, they cook dinner and do dishes once a week. It is lovely to not have that to do once a week. They also do their own laundry. So, I mean, I think there's a sense of when they are feeling really capable and confident, they are going to do more, and it makes your life easier, right? You have less to think about and to remember to do, for one thing. So there's that. And then I think there's the layer of, if we're not micromanaging and so like worried about every aspect of our child's life and feeling like we need to get involved, like tell the coach my son should have more playing time, and email the teacher every time my child gets a bad grade. That is stress, right? That is stress and anxiety that is accumulating within us. And in fact, we know from the burnout literature that the more burned out we are, the more we take on, because we just don't have the filter. It's not working anymore. And we just keep doing, right, without checking in with ourselves. So I do worry about parents. I feel like parents are more stressed right now than they've been I mean, the surveys show this, like parents are really stressed and burning out. And we're doing so much for our kids. And I wrote an article actually called "Are We Choosing Burnout?" Like, there are ways we are doing this to ourselves. And if we can see it, we can change it, and it will help our stress levels. So the other thing that is really important to me is being really compassionate in parenting. And like I was saying, this is not a zero-sum game. This isn't like you do autonomy supportive parenting or you don't. This is we do our best every day, and we give grace to ourselves, and we don't have to be perfect and be doing all the strategies all the time. Like taking some of those expectations off of ourselves and being really human is actually so much better for our kids too. Like I noticed when I relaxed more, my kids relaxed more. Like they wanted to be around me more in a fun way, not I need you to do this for me way, but like we can just hang out, and we don't have to be, I don't have to be harping on them for stuff, and they don't have to be worried I'm going to. So I'm not saying I don't want to act like this is the panacea, because it's still hard, because parenting is hard. If you're doing parenting well, it's hard. That's it. It's messy. It's complicated. We're all humans. We have little humans growing into big humans, and we're like in charge of them. And it's hard. There's going to be stressful times. But I think if we can have this bigger picture approach of we trust our kids, and we value our relationship with our kids, and we are all human in this, that takes some of the pressure off.
Yeah, definitely. I love the idea of just giving yourself grace. That's something that I think we can apply even beyond parenting, just in your general life. Give yourself grace. So that was the last question that we have. Before we end the webinar, is there anything that you want to share, shout out, just last words?
I don't know, I'm just really excited to have this book out in the world, and I hope that if anyone gets anything positive out of this book and have like a special moment where they're like, oh my gosh, it worked and it felt so good, please tell me. Like, I want to hear about it. I want to know what's going on out there. If you do something and you're like, oh, that was a fail, what happened? I want to hear about that too. Like, I really want to know what it's like in the trenches beyond my circle of friends, who are sharing with me. But I am really open, and I'm always learning. So I love to hear from other people and everyone's experiences.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to always hear feedback too. Sometimes you don't know what's going on out there. So that is our webinar for today. So we have recorded this, we will share it. There will be a link available, so you can also share it if you have a friend that might want to try this out. Emily is online at emilyedlynphd.com, so you can visit her website. The book itself is available everywhere books are sold. So pick it up wherever is closest to you. And we thank everybody for joining the webinar today and for taking their time to watch this. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.